Coming up today here on the Raiders Report, I'm going to be ranking the top 10 players most likely to not make the roster who made it in 2023. I'm Mitchell Renz, host of the Raiders Report, and I'm not sitting up here saying that all 10 of these players that you're about to see are not going to make the team. I am simply saying that AP and Telesco, I think, did a good job in the draft. AP and Telesco, I think, did a good job in free agency, and this roster is getting better. The one good part about your roster getting better is, well, your team gets better. The bad part is sometimes you got to move on from players that, the fan base kind of falls in love with here a little bit. So to me, I have them ranked from 10 down to 1. 10 being the least likely to not make the roster, okay? Number 1 is the player that I think is the most likely to not make the roster that made it in 2023. Let's go to number 10 here on the list, and we're going to start at the linebacker position. It is Amari Burney, and I should also mention these are the players that made the roster for the initial August 29th 53-man roster cut list. So if you don't know that list, you can go and look it up. Amari Burney was drafted in the 6th round out of Florida by our regime last season. I like Burney. He's a really good athlete. Still needs to develop into a player a little bit here. But with the fact that the Raiders drafted Tommy Eichenberg in the 5th round, that puts Burney in kind of an interesting spot. On top of that, I don't know how many linebackers this organization decides to keep, because Spillane, he's going to make the team. I envision Divine Diablo is going to make this team. Eichenberg is going to make this roster. If they only keep 4 linebackers, that could be a serious battle between Luke Masterson and Burney. I will admit Burney gives you a little bit more special teams value. He's definitely, though, on the hot seat. Let's go to number 9, and guess what? We're going to go right back to the linebacker room, and everything that I just stated about Burney, you can absolutely apply that to Masterson, a player who, according to the PFF, was actually one of the better players that the Raiders had, and definitely the better coverage guy, and has done a good job since he was a UDFA coming out of Wake Forest. But this was somebody that kind of got his footing going with McDaniel Ziegler. He's 100% shown, Patrick Graham, that he has the ability and a little bit of a sponge to be able to absorb some information and go out there and get it done. But again, if the Raiders decide to keep only 4 linebackers, which I do think is a realistic possibility, that way they can keep maybe an extra lineman, maybe you keep an extra corner, maybe you keep an extra safety, a defensive end. It happens year in and year out. And if this organization is picking between Masterson and Burney, which I do think is the 5-4 combination of the linebacker depth chart, they're going to have to make a tough decision. Maybe they keep both of them. Bottom line is, though, it's absolutely a possibility that both Burney and Masterson do not make this squad this upcoming season. So my question to all of you out there is this, and I'm going to be asking a lot of questions here on today's show because I ask questions every show here on the Raiders Report. How many linebackers make the Raiders roster? So there's going to be a 53-man cut down. David Agoa, who is the International Pathway Program player, he automatically makes this team just because it doesn't make any sense to cut him. You keep that extra player. But in terms of linebackers, how many make it? 3, 4, 5, 2? Let me know down below. And if you want to know my answer that I have most recently featured in a video, I put out a video every single day, at least one on this channel. We go live 3 times at least a week in the off season. And I put out a video, Raiders 53-man roster projection if the season started today. Find out how many linebackers I put in this one. This video is also going to be available to y'all down in the comments and in the description of today's show. I got to give a shout out to the Noti Gang, people that I know watch that show and watch all of our shows here and take pride of hitting that subscribe button, taking pride in turning on that notification bell, and every time I drop a vid, get down in their comments. So Ron, Isaac, Dominique, Suicide Guns, shout out to you. Believe me, I see it, and I appreciate it. Let's go to number 8 here. It's Isaiah Pola-Mao, strong safety, and the Raiders re-signed him this offseason. And this is another player that I do like, and I think that he's a hell of a versatile player, can offer you a bunch of different things in terms of a box linebacker, strong safety, put on a little bit of weight last season, and shows flashes in the pan of being a good, reliable player. But then again, you have Merrick, you have Marcus Epps. Those are your top 2 safeties. The Raiders drafted Trey Taylor in the 7th round, and I know it's in the 7th round, but that's a guy that I actually am very surprised ended up going in round 7. Solid dude. Best defensive back in college football last season was the award that he won. I'm not saying that he is the best DB in college, or obviously he would have went a lot earlier. But to me, the Raiders got to make a choice. Like, do you decide to keep Pola-Mao? Do you decide to keep a guy that was drafted in the 5th round and Chris Smith II last season? a lot of tough decisions, and kind of like what we were looking here with Burney and Masterson, I'm going to say the exact same thing here for Isaiah Pola-Mao and Chris Smith. Burney drafted in the 6th round, Masterson, UDFA. Isaiah Pola-Mao, UDFA. Chris Smith drafted in the 5th round. And we didn't get to see him all that much. This was a player, though, that Chugs was pretty high on. And from some of the coaches that I know in the Raiders organization, this is a guy that's just got it up here, okay? Really, really smart player and is already way ahead of his time is what I've been told. He might not have the most athletically gifted body, and I don't know how much special teams value he truly is able to give to this organization. But man, oh man, Chris Smith in the 5th round, new regime, absolutely going to be fighting for that roster spot. Before I get into the top 6 players that made the roster last year that I think are the most likely to miss it this season, I got to give a shout out to our sponsor, PrizePicks. $100 deposit match when you go to PrizePicks.com/CLNS and you use code CLNS for those first-time depositors. You can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with NBA, NHL, and MLB entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. I know I ask a lot of questions on this show, and I also know that a lot of times I give my predictions on some of the things that I'm going for on PrizePicks. So you know what? Depending on what you guys vote for here is what I'm going to go with. Right now, the only 2 things that you can do on PrizePicks both revolve around Brock Bowers. You can either go Brock Bowers receiving yards or Brock Bowers receiving touchdowns. For the sake of this argument and for the sake of the show, I want to see what you pick here. Do you believe the tight end, wide receiver hybrid out of Georgia that the Raiders drafted at number 13 overall, is he going to have more or less than 5.5 receiving touchdowns? Chugs is going like this. So let's hammer the more on this one. And if you want to take advantage of this over at PrizePicks right now, go win some money. Go put your money where your mouth is. And if you want to get started, again, you can find that link. It's going to be available to you all down in the comments and down in the description of today's show. Go to PrizePicks.com/CLNS. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Shout out to them for sponsoring today's show. Let's go to the cornerback position here. Jakorian Bennett, drafted in round 4. In fact, the Raiders traded up for him in round 4 in the 2023 NFL draft. And when he was on the field last season, well, maybe he was matching his number because he was a 0. And I was surprised because I was really hoping that Jakorian was going to look a lot better on film. He's a good athlete. I'm telling y'all right now, Bennett is a good athlete. Just needs to figure out the technique. And the leap that I'm hoping that he takes is the leap that Trevon Merrick did compared to year 1 with Patrick Graham to year 2 with Patrick Graham. Much different, right? A guy like Malcolm Kuntz, year 1 with Patrick Graham, I'm going to blame that a little bit more on McDaniels, then gets some good coaches, Antonio Pierce in the mix, takes that leap forward. He has an opportunity, but what if he loses out to DeCamerion Richardson, loses out to MJ Devonshire, and let's not sleep on Sam Webb, a player that I feel like every single year we just kind of ignore, but seems to find a way to get his spot on this team by the end of the season. And then Brandon Facyson is a player that I 100% would move on from, but he has somehow figured out a way to keep a spot here on this roster. Next name coming up here on our roster, bubble candidates, people that made the team last year that I don't know if they're going to make it this year. Nesta, Jade, Silvera at the defensive tackle position. There's a lot of rumors out there around certain players, certain things. Not too much stuff going on around Nesta, Jade. Here's the thing, though. Actions speak louder than words, and the Raiders have shown you that they wanted to put a big old stamp at the defensive tackle position. You go out, you sign a Kristian Wilkerson. You go out, you re-sign Adam Butler, re-sign John Jenkins. And as it stands right now, the defensive tackle room is one of the strongest rooms out there for the Raiders, especially if Tyree Wilson is going to get some work on the interior, which he absolutely is. Did the Silver and Black decide to bring back Nesta, Jade, Silvera, and Marquand McCall? Yes, they did. However, though, just because Silvera has some of those AP ties back from their days with the Sun Devils does not make him a lock to make this team, on top of the fact that it's a brand new regime. What I really think this one comes down to is who ends up winning a battle between Nesta, Jade, and a guy like Byron Young. So Byron Young was drafted in round 3, picked 74 overall by Ziegler and Josh McDaniels, and did not get any playing time really last season. Was a healthy scratch multiple times. From what I was told, he actually looked pretty good in June and July. Then he suffered a minor injury and was never really able to get back up to full strength. So I'm curious to see if that was the reason that really zapped him of some of his potential last season. You're not only talking about a rookie year, but also dealing with injury. I'm hoping that he's a little bit better this upcoming season, but again, there is a lot of bodies there on the interior, and depending on how many DTs that this organization decides to keep, Byron Young might be one of the odd men out. So here's the fun game to play. I want you to pick one to keep. Let's say, because right now as it stands, the Raiders have 3 open roster spots. Let's say the Raiders do something really nice, and they go out and they sign 3 players that could potentially start and are better than all of these guys. But then that means you got to only keep one of them. Are you going to keep Byron Young, type BY? Are you going to keep Nesta, Jade, Silvera, NS, Jakorian Bennett, JB, Chris Smith, CS? For me personally, I am going to end up keeping Jakorian Bennett. And the reason why that I'm keeping Bennett is because of the depth. I am more confident in our defensive tackles than I am our cornerback room. I think that's safe to say. I'm also more confident in our safeties in Meredith and Epps than I am just our top corners. Jakorian has an opportunity to potentially start for this team, so for that reason, I'm going to keep Jakorian Bennett. Let's go to number 3, and this is where I really think that this list kind of begins here. Jordan Meredith on the offensive line. Meredith was a player that I could not believe / it was 100% a McDaniels, Ziegler type of move. Did they bring him back this offseason? Yes, they did. It's a cheap contract, and he does give you some of that guard flexibility. If you want to lean on Cody Whitehair a little bit more and then want maybe something more from like a Johanning, a guy that's a UDFA, Delmar Glaze there, Munford show you something nice. What if Dalton Wagner really steps up or something this offseason? You could go a lot of different directions here. I've also heard that the organization likes McKenzie as a potential offensive tackle. So if you really just want to rely on Whitehair to be that interior guard, and you also drafted Glaze, who gives you some offensive guard flexibility there, Munford, who gives you some offensive guard flexibility, just the name to be able to throw out there and keep in mind. Let's go to cornerback now, Brandon Facyson. And despite Facyson being injured for essentially the entire year, he did make the initial 53-man roster, which again, it's just more of a head scratcher, and it's probably one of the just many reasons that McDaniels isn't around anymore. The Raiders knew that he wasn't going to be able to play for a very long time, and yet he still made this team, and he did not get put on IR right away. The NFL does have new IR rules when it comes to the 53-man roster, so like you can put a guy on IR and then keep another player instead of like having to keep him and then putting him on the IR, and then you could sign somebody later. I like the rules a little bit better this season. The reason why he's on here, though, is because you can cut him and save $2.6 million. The way contracts are starting to work, you could find a player that I do believe helps your team a lot more succeed right away than Brandon Facyson. $2.6 million, I'll take that money. But the number one, and I'll be real, this one to me is not all that close, and if I'm wrong in saying that, I owe this guy a sorry card. The number one player most likely to not make the team this season that made it last year, and again, I don't think it's close, Kristian Wilkerson at the wide receiver position. I can't believe Wilkerson made the roster last season, and I'm not trying to take anything away from him, right? I'm sure he worked his tail off. All these guys have stories that I'm sure are great stories. But let's face it, he made this team because he was a Patriot. And I don't know if you could tell me something different than that. Like, did he do anything in preseason, a certain action that was like, wow, I can't believe this guy made it? To me, all it was McDaniels knew he had somebody in his corner, and that's why Wilkerson made this team. Like, he hung around on the roster, on the practice squad. Like, you got to give him a little bit of credit there. But because the Raiders, you know, you go out, you sign Michael Gallup, you draft Brock Bowers, you got Jacoby, you got Devontae, you got Trey Tucker. Like, I don't see how in the world Kristian Wilkerson ends up making this silver and black roster this season. Maybe he finds himself on the practice squad, but I think if you were to ask 100 Raider fans out there, will Kristian Wilkerson make the roster? I think 90 fans say no. I think 10 fans say, who the hell is that guy? So one more time here, we got roster bubble candidates coming in here, and this list is 10 players that made the team last season that I could see not making the team this upcoming season. I will admit there is a really big tier break with Meredith, Facyson, and then another really big tier break with Kristian Wilkerson. If you watched today's show and you enjoyed it, hey, make sure that you're sharing our content here. I want the Raiders Report to continue to grow. And sometimes we find the best fans of the nation, the best fans of the Raiders Report, the people that just, quite frankly, I'm the most down to grab a beer with. People that watch the show May, June, and July. Why? If you're watching the Raiders Report in May, June, and July, you're a diehard. You're a real one, and those are the people that I like to associate myself with. So please hit up Chugs and I. Continue to tune in all offseason. I promise you this. We're going to bring that commitment to excellence every single day here on the Raiders Report because it's what we do. I want you to – you got to show the face. You got to show the face. No, not going to do it? Not going to do it. Shout out to the nation for tuning in to the Raiders Report.